There's something haunting about watching a man who never stayed for anyone finally stop running. Bob Dylan, the voice of a generation, the poet who kept the world at arm's length, the wanderer who turned elusiveness into an art form. He met a woman who made him want to build a home. Her name was Sara, and for a brief, beautiful moment in time, the man who wrote about freedom and restless highways found something he'd never known before: peace. But this isn't a story about happily ever after. This is a story about how even the deepest love can crumble when you're a man who's spent your whole life running. And suddenly, you forget why you stopped. The year was 1964, and Bob Dylan was already becoming a legend. He was 23 years old, riding the wave of folk music that was sweeping across America, his voice cutting through the cultural noise like a knife through silk. He'd dated Suze Rotolo, the girl on the cover of the freewheelin' Bob Dylan. And by then he was romantically involved with Joan Baez, the queen of folk music herself. Dylan moved through relationships like he moved through songs, intensely, briefly, always looking for the next verse, the next bridge, the next escape route. Women fell in love with his brilliance, his mystery, his refusal to be pinned down. And just when they thought they'd caught him, he'd slip away like smoke through their fingers. Dylan wasn't the settling type. Everyone knew that. Dylan himself probably knew that. But then came Sara Lownds, and everything changed. Sara wasn't just another face in the crowd. She was 25 years old, a former fashion model who'd worked with the prestigious Ford agency, and by 1964, she was working as a secretary in the film production division of Time Life, alongside documentary filmmakers like D.A. Pennebaker. She had dark, mysterious eyes and a presence that commanded attention without demanding it. But here's the thing that made Sara different from all the other women in Dylan's orbit. She wasn't trying to catch him. She wasn't chasing the legend. When they met, Sara was still married to her first husband, Hans Lownds, a photographer 25 years her senior, and she already had a young daughter named Maria. Sara's life was complicated, messy, already full. She didn't need Bob Dylan to complete her. And maybe that's exactly why he couldn't stay away. The way their relationship began was quiet, almost secret. While Dylan was still publicly linked to Joan Baez, he and Sara started becoming close in late 1964. There's a certain kind of intimacy that develops in secret. It's raw, it's honest, because it exists outside the judgment of the world. They weren't performing their relationship for cameras or critics. They were just two people who found something real in each other. Sara left her husband. She left her stable, established life. For Bob Dylan, that meant something. Here was a woman who'd given up everything, not for the legend, not for the fame, but for him, the man behind the mystique, the person beneath the persona. And that terrified him as much as it thrilled him. By November 1964, Bob and Sara were living together in separate rooms at New York's legendary Chelsea Hotel, that bohemian paradise where artists, poets, and musicians created their own universe away from the conventional world. It was romantic in the way only the Chelsea Hotel could be, gritty, artistic, authentic. Dylan was writing some of his most important work during this period, and Sara was there, not as a muse in the traditional sense, but as a grounding force. She didn't worship him. She didn't try to change him. She just existed beside him, and that was revolutionary for a man like Bob Dylan. Then Sara got pregnant, and Bob Dylan, the man who'd spent his entire career singing about freedom and Highway 61 and going wherever the wind took him, made a decision that shocked everyone who knew him. On November 22nd, 1965, Bob Dylan and Sara Lownds got married. Secretly. Quietly. No press. No announcement. No fanfare. Just a simple ceremony, and suddenly, the wanderer had a wife. They had a son, Jesse, and Dylan officially adopted Sara's daughter, Maria. And then came Anna, Sam, and Jacob. 4 children in total. Bob Dylan, father of 4, living a domestic life in Woodstock, New York. If you'd told anyone in 1963 that this would be Dylan's future, they would have laughed in your face. But love does strange things to people. It makes them want things they never thought they needed. The songs he wrote about Sara during this time are some of the most beautiful in his entire catalog. Sad-Eyed Lady of the Lowlands, that 11-minute epic that closes out Blonde on Blonde, was written about Sara. The whole of Side 4, just one song, Dylan pouring out his love in a stream of consciousness that feels like watching someone fall in love in real time. Love -0/No Limit captured the way Sara loved him, without demands, without conditions. She didn't try to clip his wings. She didn't ask him to be anyone other than who he was. And for a man like Dylan, who'd spent his whole life shape-shifting and reinventing himself. That kind of acceptance was intoxicating. Then came July 29th, 1966, and everything changed again. Dylan had been touring relentlessly, pushing himself to the brink of exhaustion, dealing with the controversy of going electric, facing boos and criticism from folk purists who felt betrayed by his evolution. He was burned out, frayed at the edges, running on fumes. And then he crashed his Triumph Tiger 100 motorcycle near his home in Woodstock. The details of the accident have always been murky. Some say he broke several vertebrae in his neck. Others suggest the injuries were less severe than reported, and conspiracy theories have swirled for decades about whether the accident was as serious as Dylan claimed or whether it was a convenient excuse to escape the grinding pressure of fame. But here's what we know for certain. After that crash, Bob Dylan disappeared from public life. And Sara was there through all of it. The motorcycle accident gave Dylan something he desperately needed: an escape hatch. For the next year and a half, he withdrew almost completely from the public eye. No tours, no albums, no press conferences. Just Bob and Sara and their children in Woodstock, living a quiet, domestic life that seemed impossible for someone of Dylan's stature. Sara nursed him back to health, whether his injuries were physical or spiritual or both. She gave him space to breathe, to think, to remember who he was beneath all the noise and expectation. This period produced the legendary basement tapes, those raw, experimental recordings Dylan made with the band in the basement of their Woodstock home. It was music for music's sake, created without the pressure of commercial success or critical approval. And it happened because Sara gave him a safe place to land. For a while, it seemed like maybe Dylan had actually changed. Maybe love had tamed the restless wanderer. Maybe Sara was the woman who could make him stay. They had their family. They had their home. They had a life that, from the outside, looked almost normal. But underneath the surface, something was shifting. Because here's the truth about Bob Dylan. He'd spent his entire life running from anything that felt like a cage, even if that cage was made of love and security and everything most people dream of having. The man who wrote like a rolling stone wasn't built for white picket fences. And slowly, inevitably, he started to feel trapped. By the early 1970s, cracks were beginning to show. Dylan started touring again. He started disappearing again. The pattern that Sara thought she'd broken was reasserting itself. And this time, it was stronger than her love could hold back. He began having affairs. The man who'd written those beautiful love songs about his wife was now cheating on her, seeking something: excitement, danger, novelty, escape, that domestic life couldn't provide. And Sara, who'd given up her marriage, her stability, her entire life for this man, watched as the person she'd married slowly slipped away. Then came 1974, and Dylan recorded Blood on the Tracks. If you want to understand the dissolution of Bob and Sara's marriage, you don't need tabloid rumors or interviews. You just need to listen to that album. It's devastating. It's raw. It's angry and confused and heartbroken. And it's Dylan chronicling the end of his marriage in real time, turning his personal apocalypse into art. Songs like Tangled Up in Blue, Idiot Wind, and You're Gonna Make Me Lonesome When You Go are about love collapsing, about recognizing your own role in destroying something beautiful, about the specific kind of pain that comes from knowing you're the villain in your own story. Dylan later claimed the songs weren't autobiographical, that people were reading too much into them, but Sara heard those lyrics and she knew. She knew exactly what they meant. Idiot Wind, in particular, is brutal. You're an idiot, babe. It's a wonder that you still know how to breathe. That's not abstract poetry. That's rage. That's a man lashing out at someone he loves because he doesn't know how else to express the chaos inside him. And Sara, listening to her husband sing those words, must have felt like she was being eviscerated in public, her private pain turned into entertainment for millions of people. By the summer of 1974, Sara had had enough. Dylan's behavior had become increasingly erratic. He was drinking again, smoking again. The careful peace they'd built in Woodstock was crumbling like a sandcastle at high tide. They separated. Dylan moved back to Minnesota, to a farmhouse where he could be alone with his demons and his guitar. And Sara stayed in Woodstock with their children, trying to hold together what was left of their family. But here's where the story gets even more complicated, even more heartbreaking. Because Dylan couldn't let her go completely. In 1975, he wrote Sara, a song that appeared on his album Desire. It's one of the most direct, emotionally vulnerable songs Dylan ever wrote. 7.5 minutes of him literally begging his wife to take him back. Sara, Sara, wherever we travel we're never apart. Sara, oh Sara, beautiful lady, so dear to my heart. He remembers their times together, their children, the beach, their home, and he's pleading with her to remember those moments too, to remember what they had before he destroyed it. Don't ever leave me, don't ever go, he sings, his voice cracking with emotion. The song was recorded during a period when Bob and Sara attempted to reconcile. She even came to the studio while he was recording it. Can you imagine that moment? Sara, listening to her husband pour out his heart in song, asking herself if it was enough, if words and melodies could repair the damage that had been done. For a brief moment, it seemed like maybe they could salvage something. Dylan invited Sara to join him on the Rolling Thunder Revue tour in 1975, that wild, theatrical traveling circus of music and performance that included Joan Baez, Joni Mitchell, and a host of other artists. It should have been a reconciliation. It should have been Dylan proving to Sara that he'd changed, that he wanted her in his life. But instead, the tour became another reminder of why they couldn't work. Joan Baez was there, Dylan's old flame, the woman he'd left for Sara over a decade earlier. The dynamic was uncomfortable, charged with history and unresolved tension. And Dylan, being Dylan, seemed almost to enjoy the chaos of having both women in his orbit. The reconciliation didn't last. It couldn't last. Because Bob Dylan was still Bob Dylan, and no amount of beautiful songs could change the fundamental truth that he didn't know how to stay. By March 1, 1977, Sara filed for divorce. The proceedings were messy, painful, and very public, everything their marriage hadn't been. The settlement was reportedly worth $36 million, a staggering sum that made headlines and turned their private tragedy into public spectacle. Sara got their family home in Malibu and primary custody of their children. Dylan got his freedom, which was probably what he'd wanted all along, even if he didn't know how to admit it to himself. In the divorce proceedings, there were allegations of abuse, of Dylan hitting Sara during an argument, claims that added another layer of darkness to an already tragic story. The man who'd sung about love with such poetry had allegedly raised his hand against the woman he'd promised to cherish. Whether those allegations were true or exaggerated in the heat of a bitter divorce, they painted a picture of a relationship that had gone from transcendent to toxic. After the divorce, Dylan married again, to Carolyn Dennis, one of his backup singers, in another secret ceremony in 1986. They had a daughter together, and that marriage also ended in divorce in 1992. The pattern repeated itself. Dylan, it seemed, was incapable of the kind of sustained intimacy that marriage demands. He could write about love beautifully, could capture its essence in 3-minute songs that moved millions, but he couldn't live it day after day, year after year. He was a brilliant artist but a flawed man, and those two things were probably inseparable. Sara, for her part, largely disappeared from public life after the divorce. She didn't write a tell-all book. She didn't give bitter interviews. She raised her children away from the spotlight and lived her life with the same quiet dignity that had characterized her years with Dylan. In later years, Dylan himself reflected on the end of his marriage to Sara with something approaching understanding. He recognized that the collapse of their relationship came down to an impossible choice: his career or his family, his art or his marriage. I wasn't about to go on stage and perform like a monkey. I didn't want to do that anymore, he said in one interview, acknowledging that the relentless demands of his career had made a normal family life impossible. But that's a convenient way to frame it, isn't it? As if his career was something separate from him, an external force that destroyed his marriage, rather than acknowledging that he chose his art over his family again and again and again. The tragedy of Bob Dylan and Sara Lownds isn't that they fell out of love. It's that they probably never stopped loving each other. But love wasn't enough to overcome who Dylan fundamentally was. A man in perpetual motion, a poet of restlessness, someone who needed freedom more than he needed happiness. Sara was the only woman who made him want to stay. She was the only one who made him build a home, raise a family, imagine a future that looked like everyone else's normal. And he destroyed it all because staying still felt too much like dying. Listen to Sara, again with this context. Listen to Dylan singing, "Stayin' up for days in the Chelsea Hotel, writin', sad-eyed lady of the Lowlands for you." Listen to him remembering the beach and the children and the life they built together. Listen to the desperation in his voice when he sings, "Don't ever leave me, don't ever go." That's not a character in a song. That's Bob Dylan himself, stripped of all his defenses and personas, admitting that he found something irreplaceable and he let it slip through his fingers. And Sara, wherever she was when she heard that song, must have felt both vindicated and heartbroken. Vindicated that he finally understood what he'd lost, heartbroken that understanding came too late to save them. What makes this story so compelling, so painfully human, is that it's a story about incompatibility that looks like perfect compatibility. On paper, Bob and Sara were soulmates. She understood his art. She gave him space to create. She didn't try to change him or control him. She loved him without conditions. And he loved her. You can hear it in every note of Sad-Eyed Lady of the Lowlands, in every desperate lyric of Sara. But love doesn't exist on paper. It exists in the daily grind of living with another person, of compromising and communicating and choosing them over and over again. And Dylan, for all his brilliance, couldn't do that consistently enough to make it work. There's a line in Tangled Up in Blue, where Dylan sings about a woman he used to know. She was married when we first met, soon to be divorced. That's Sara. The whole song is about their relationship, about how they came together and fell apart, and how he still thinks about her years later. How she's woven into the fabric of his identity, even after everything ended. Dylan spent the rest of his career writing songs that circled back to the themes of love and loss and regret that defined his relationship with Sara. She haunts his work the way first loves always do. Not as a ghost, but as a benchmark, a reminder of what was possible before he destroyed it. In the decades since their divorce, Dylan has been notoriously private about his personal life. He rarely speaks about Sara in interviews. When asked about the autobiographical nature of his songs, he deflects and obfuscates, hiding behind layers of irony and misdirection. But you can't unhear blood on the tracks. You can't unknow that Sara is a direct, unfiltered plea for forgiveness. The songs tell the truth even when Dylan won't. And the truth is that Sara Lownds was the great love of Bob Dylan's life, and he sabotaged it with the same relentless determination he brought to his art. What happened to Sara after the divorce is largely a mystery, which is probably how she wanted it. She didn't capitalize on her connection to one of the most famous musicians in history. She didn't sell her story. She simply lived her life, raised her children, and moved forward. There's dignity in that, a refusal to let her identity be defined by her relationship to Bob Dylan. She was her own person before she met him, and she remained her own person after he left. That's more than can be said for many people who get caught in the orbit of someone that famous, that influential. Bob Dylan's career continued to soar after the divorce. He released more albums, won more awards, became even more of an icon. In 2016, he became the first musician ever to win the Nobel Prize in Literature, a recognition of his contributions to culture that put him in the company of the greatest writers in history. He achieved everything an artist could dream of achieving. But if you listen closely to his work, really listen, you can hear the cost of that achievement. You can hear the relationships sacrificed, the ordinary joys foregone, the price of being Bob Dylan. The story of Bob Dylan and Sara isn't a cautionary tale about fame or art-destroying love, though it's certainly that. It's a story about the fundamental incompatibility between two things most people want: freedom and connection, wildness and stability, adventure and home. Dylan spent his whole career singing about being on the road, about rejecting convention, about refusing to be tied down. And then he met someone who made him want to be tied down, and he spent over a decade trying to be someone he wasn't. The marriage didn't fail because Sara wasn't enough. It failed because Dylan couldn't reconcile his need for freedom with his desire for love. And in the end, freedom won. There's something deeply sad about that, because Sara represented everything Dylan thought he didn't want until he had it. She gave him children who adored him. She gave him a home where he could create in peace. She gave him unconditional love and support through his most difficult times. She was his anchor when the world was trying to tear him apart. And it still wasn't enough to make him stay. That says something profound about Bob Dylan, about his genius, his demons, his fundamental inability to accept the kind of ordinary happiness that most people spend their lives seeking. When you watch old footage of Bob and Sara together from the 1960s and early 70s, there's a chemistry between them that's undeniable. The way he looks at her, the way she calms him with just her presence. They weren't performing for the camera. They were genuinely connected. And knowing how it ended makes those moments almost unbearable to watch. It's like watching a beautiful building before it catches fire. You know what's coming, and you want to reach through time and warn them, tell them to hold on tighter, try harder, love better. But you can't. The fire always comes. The building always burns. Sara remains one of Dylan's most powerful songs precisely because it's so uncharacteristically direct. For once, he's not hiding behind metaphor or surrealism or poetic abstraction. He's just saying what he means. I love you, I miss you, I'm sorry, please come back. And the fact that Sara didn't come back, that she couldn't come back because too much had been broken, makes the song that much more heartbreaking. It's a monument to a lost love, a 7.5-minute admission of failure from a man who rarely admitted to failing at anything. So what's the lesson here? Maybe there isn't one. Maybe some stories don't have lessons, they just have endings. Bob Dylan found the love of his life, and he destroyed it because he was too restless, too selfish, too addicted to his own mythology to do the work that love requires. Sara Lownds gave everything to a man who couldn't give everything back, and she emerged from that experience with scars, but also with her dignity intact. Their children grew up in the shadow of their parents' epic love and equally epic collapse. And the rest of us are left with the songs, those beautiful, terrible, honest songs that document one of the greatest romances and one of the saddest divorces in rock and roll history. Sara was the only woman who made Bob Dylan stay. For a while. For a moment. For long enough that we got Sad-Eyed Lady of the Lowlands, and Sara, and a glimpse of what Bob Dylan might have been if he'd chosen differently. But he didn't choose differently. He chose his art, his freedom, his endless restless searching. And Sara, bless her, eventually chose herself. She walked away from the legend and built a life beyond Bob Dylan's shadow. In a way, that makes her the stronger one. She loved the man behind the myth, and walked away when that man proved he couldn't love her back with the consistency she deserved. Decades later, Dylan's songs about Sara still resonate because they capture something universal about love and loss. We've all loved someone we couldn't keep. We've all looked back on a relationship and wondered what we could have done differently. We've all felt that specific kind of regret that comes from knowing you had something precious and you let it go. Bob Dylan just happened to have a guitar and a genius for turning his mistakes into art that would outlive him. Sara Lownds didn't get songs written about her because she was Bob Dylan's wife. Dylan wrote songs about her because she was extraordinary in her own right. Mysterious, beautiful, patient, strong enough to love a difficult man without losing herself completely. She made Bob Dylan believe in home. She made him want to be a father and a husband. She made him, for a brief and shining moment, almost normal. And then she survived him. She survived the marriage, the divorce, the public scrutiny, and she did it with a grace that Dylan's art could capture, but his life never quite managed to embody. That's her legacy. Not just as the inspiration for some of Bob Dylan's greatest songs, but as a woman who loved completely and then, when that love was no longer returned, had the strength to walk away. In the end, maybe she was always too good for him. But she loved him anyway. And that's what makes their story so devastating and so unforgettable.